What's up guys, I'm BTC. For a while I've been talking about how adding more passive abilities to the game could help with hero balance. Today I want to talk about why every character should have a passive. I'm also going to go into the reasons why passives can help the game, and because it's been a very popular request, I'm also going to list my suggestions on what some of those passive abilities could be. Let's start by talking about why all the characters should have a passive. When it comes to balancing characters, it's kind of the reverse of what you might expect. The general belief is that the more stuff you have, the harder it is to balance, but that's not true. In fact, the more characters you have, the easier it is to make sure that a small number of them are not too strong. If you have enough counters and other hero synergies, that means that any one particular team comp has a difficult time of completely dominating the rest. One of the reasons why some of the meta issues we have in Overwatch are occurring is because there just isn't enough variety. The same concept applies with individual character balance and the abilities. Think of it this way: if you only have two very large dials for a character, one controlling health and one controlling damage, then it's a little difficult to balance that character because any adjustment to those dials has a huge impact on the character as a whole. But if you have many small dials that all control a variety of things, then you can make more finely tuned, precise adjustments. Those little tiny incremental changes to the dials don't have such a significant impact on the character as a whole. You can adjust each one of them a little bit in order to more finely tune and balance that character. When it comes to Overwatch, there's a limit to how many abilities each character can have. This is because of the way the control system works that Blizzard set up. If Overwatch was only a PC game, then you could probably have a lot more abilities because there are more keys on the keyboard. But Blizzard wanted to make the game available for console players as well, and there's just only so many buttons on a controller, and Blizzard has already maxed them out. However, passive abilities don't require any new buttons. Most of them don't require a button press at all, and the ones that do typically use stuff like jump and crouch. This means that Blizzard could add a passive ability for every character and not have to worry about the limitation of buttons. There have already been more than a few changes to passive abilities. Reaper's lifesteal has been buffed and nerfed several times, same thing with Doomfist's passive. Reinhardt got a brand new passive that he didn't have for most of the early part of the game. This passive, after it was added, was found to be not quite strong enough, and it was buffed. So Blizzard was able to make Reinhardt a little bit more balanced, a little stronger, without having to change his damage, his health, or any of his other abilities. All because they added the passive. Now I know what some of you might be thinking. Right away, if you add passive abilities to characters that don't currently have them, then automatically, by definition, that is a buff for all of those characters. I also know that some of you may not want to see those heroes like Mei or Moira getting that kind of a buff. However, keep in mind, in the theoretical situation that those characters did in fact get a new passive ability, that many of those heroes would also have to get some kind of other minor balance adjustments in order to compensate for having the new passive. However, in the long run, I believe that adding passive abilities to all the characters would be much better because it would grant Blizzard another tool, another one of those dials that they could use to better balance the characters. So short term, yeah, it would probably take a little bit more adjusting, making those minor balance tweaks in order to compensate for the passives, but long term, you're going to have a more balanced game. Having said all that, let's get into some of the fun stuff. What new passives could we add to the characters? Right away, I'm going to skip all the ones that already have a passive. While it's true that some of them could probably use a new one that's better or different from what they currently have, I'm not going to focus on that. Instead, I want to focus on the characters that just don't have one right now. Keep in mind that a good passive needs to do something extra for the character and will often apply to more than one ability. Let me give you some examples. If Tracer had a passive that caused her to deal damage when blinking through an enemy, then that would be a really bad passive. I mean, it might be an effective tool to have, but it would be a bad passive. Because if you wanted to add damage to the blink ability, then it would make a whole lot more sense to simply put it into the ability itself instead of tacking it on as some extra kind of passive. However, If you wanted to give Tracer a slight damage boost every time she used any kind of an ability, then that would work as a passive, because it was doing something that would affect several abilities at the same time. Obviously, that example would be way too strong, but I think you guys get the point. So basically, passives need to either affect multiple abilities or do something else that's interesting. Now, over the last couple weeks, I've been trying to come up with good passive abilities. I have a whiteboard behind me with a list of all the characters. You can see that right here. I did change some of them, though. Anytime I would think of something interesting, I would put it up on the board. Some of them I think are pretty good and would absolutely work. Others might not be the best. Let's just be honest. And before anyone yells at me in the comment section, I know that not all of them are going to be perfectly balanced. Overall, I tried to make them interesting, useful, and also a little bit fun, and you may see many of the passives will complement each character's own individual style, but I'm certainly not going to claim that every single one of these suggestions is perfectly balanced, especially not without additional changes to the heroes, but just consider this list of passives to be more of a starting point and not necessarily the finish line, if you know what I mean. The first character on the list is Orisa. Ever since the character was released, people have been asking why she doesn't have a movement ability despite running around on 4 legs. From a game balance perspective, the character is not meant to be high mobility. It does conflict a little bit with the visual design of the character, but it's not really that big of a deal. But what if she did have a movement ability as a passive? It would have to be limited so that she can't just run around during the fight, but it would also have to be something useful. So this is what I came up with. Orisa's passive is called Gallop. If Orisa has not used any abilities, attacks, or received any damage in the last 5 seconds, then she gains a movement speed increase of 20%. The reason behind this is, again, we don't want Orisa speeding around during a fight. However, this would be an interesting way to allow Orisa to quickly relocate after a fight or during a brief pause. It also allows her to return a little bit faster after respawning. Overall, it's a useful ability, but it doesn't really change how the character is played. Next on the list is Roadhog. This was easy because I already thought of this one a long time ago. It's called Bad Deal. Attacks that damage Roadhog grant 30% less charge. Simply put, Roadhog is an ultimate battery. He always has been. That's one of the biggest problems with the character. This passive would not make Roadhog any stronger in terms of damage or health. It wouldn't prevent the enemy from gaining ult charge, but instead, it just wouldn't make it so easy. Sigma is next, and let's be honest, there are some bigger issues with the character, but for the sake of this video, I'm just gonna mostly ignore that and try to come up with an interesting passive. It's called Never Destroyed. Damage that exceeds the maximum temporary health for Kinetic Grasp will instead recharge the experimental barrier. You can only have a maximum of 400 extra temporary health from the Kinetic Grasp. After that, the damage is just simply deleted. I thought it would be funny to throw in a conservation of energy joke with the passive, and since energy cannot be truly created or destroyed, it makes sense that it would instead flow somewhere else. The interesting thing about this particular ability is that it means Kinetic Grasp could be slightly rebalanced to provide less temporary health so that the passive would be active more often. Next is Winston. This one was tough because he doesn't have a whole lot to go on. I mean, you can't even tie it to his attack because it can't critical. So this is what I came up with for Winston. His passive is called Better Defenses. The barrier projector cooldown is instantly reset whenever a teammate is eliminated. Initially, I thought about a similar passive, but instead giving Winston a damage boost, but I thought that it would be way too similar to his Primal Rage, kind of, you know, like a mini Primal Rage, and I just didn't like that idea. Also, I wanted to avoid the potential situation where a teammate might intentionally get eliminated, jump off the map or something, in order to provide additional damage boost to a Winston who might also have a nano, and I didn't want that to happen. While it's an interesting concept of sacrificing a teammate for those effects, I don't think it would be very good for the game. So with the barrier reset, there is no chance that that sort of thing would happen, as it's just simply not worth it. But it will provide a small benefit to Winston and his team when you do end up losing one of your teammates normally. Next up is Hammond. This passive is called Keep Rolling. Slowing effects are 20% less effective versus Hammond. The idea behind this passive is simple. Slowing and stunning effects are extremely hard counters versus Hammond. While I think it's important that counters exist, they should be more of a soft counter that reduces effectiveness as opposed to just completely shutting down a hero. This passive would make Hammond a little more resistant to characters like Mei, but would still be vulnerable to other things like McCree and Brigitte's stun, as well as Ana's sleep and Sombra's hack. Moving into the DPS, next is Ashe. There are several hit scan characters in the game, and each one of them has their own unique feel. I wanted the passives to complement these differences. For Ashe, her passive is called 1%. Ashe will gain a small damage increase for consecutive hits. How it works is pretty straightforward, it's just as it sounds. When Ashe is attacking, if she hits the enemy multiple times without missing, then each consecutive hit gains a small damage boost. This could stack a few times before it gets maxed out, and as soon as Ashe misses, then all of the damage bonuses are gone, they're removed. They would probably have a duration as well, maybe 5 seconds or so, in order to prevent the Ashe player from just holding on to the buff in between fights. Next is McCree, and he's another one of those hit scan characters. His passive is called the Quick. Critical hits will reduce the current cooldown of the roll ability by 2 seconds. This is obviously a play on the quick and the dead. There are a couple of important things to know about this particular passive. The only way that McCree can get a critical is with a normal hit. Fan the Hammer cannot land criticals. This means this passive will specifically reward more skillful play. Lesser skilled McCree players will still gain the benefit anytime they happen to land a critical, but higher skilled McCree players with better accuracy will be able to more consistently use this passive and by extension the roll ability, which in turn increases their potential DPS. Next up is Mei. I talked in the past about how I think she should be moved to the tank category and had adjustments to her kit, but like Sigma, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to ignore all of that and just come up with something that I think would be interesting for the hero as a DPS, even if it's not exactly the most balanced thing in her current situation. Mei's passive is called Shatter. Frozen enemies receive an additional 10% damage from all sources. Blizzard has been trying to reduce the effects of crowd control, and as a result, Mei takes a little bit longer to freeze a target. Adding a passive like this would allow Blizzard to increase that time even further, which would make it less frustrating for enemies to deal with, but at the same time, it would provide a bonus when targets do happen to get fully frozen. This wouldn't matter much versus 200 hit point characters, as Mei's normal combo already does enough, but it would provide a little extra damage against tanks, and add a small bonus for her ultimate as well. As I said though, I think Mei needs more attention overall. Moving on to Soldier 76, his passive is called On the Move. Sprinting will speed up the cooldown of his other abilities. Like with the other hitscan characters, I wanted to have a passive that complemented the existing character. Soldier has more mobility than the others, and I know it's been suggested to make the sprint ability auto-reload for Soldier, but I don't think that would be a good passive. If that was added, it should probably just be included with the sprint ability itself, as I mentioned earlier with those sorts of things. What this passive does is it allows Soldier 76 to relocate and be more prepared. The cooldown for the Helix rocket is currently 6 seconds with the new changes, so let's say Soldier uses that ability and then immediately starts to sprint. Rather than taking all 6 seconds for the cooldown, it would probably be somewhere around 4.5 or 5 seconds. Keep in mind that if Soldier is sprinting, he isn't doing anything else like attacking. So the idea of using the Helix and then just sprinting in a circle until the cooldown is up isn't very useful. Also, it's unlikely that Soldier would sprint for the full duration, so essentially what this passive does is it allows Soldier to slightly reduce the cooldown on his other abilities while he's relocating. But there are some other possibilities that I wanted to toss out there, and I'm kind of doing this one special for Soldier 76. I thought of this when someone suggested adding the ability for Soldier to aim down the sights like Ashe does. You can't do that right now because there just aren't any buttons available. But what if you moved the sprint over to passive? I could see it working in one of two ways. The first would be that sprint automatically activates after a soldier began moving forward a certain amount of time. In this example, it's 1.5 seconds. The other method would be for the player to simply tap forward twice in order to activate the sprint. This isn't out of the question because Baptiste's super jump is activated by holding crouch. By moving sprint over to a passive, it would open up one of Soldier's ability slots. You could then possibly give him something new, or you could move the Helix rocket off of that right click and onto the button where sprint was. And then you could make it so that the right click would activate the ADS, just like Ash has. For Soldier, I don't think it would make him deal more damage, but instead, it would just make his attack a little more accurate with less spread at the cost of making him move slower. Next up is Symmetra. Again, this character has some bigger issues, but once more, for the purposes of this video, we're just going to add a passive to her current state, and her passive is called Quicker Path. Unique objects that pass through a teleporter will reduce the cooldown of the next teleporter by 1 second. This passive is pretty straightforward. The unique objects can be players or constructibles like the mini turret or Torbjorn's turret. However, because they must be unique, it means that only one sentry turret would lower the cooldown. Additionally, a character cannot reduce the cooldown by going through the teleporter multiple times. Only the first time would count. At a minimum, this would reduce the cooldown by at least 2 seconds on almost every occasion because chances are both Symmetra and some of the sentry turrets will end up going through it. This is an interesting way of making the teleporter more flexible through player action as opposed to simply lowering the base cooldown on it. Next up is Torbjorn. His passive is called Perfectly Engineered. Whenever the turret is destroyed by an enemy player, Torbjorn will gain a small damage buff. One of the things that I've said about the character since the very beginning is that they should put more emphasis on Torbjorn himself and less on the turret. This was helped when they reworked the character to make the turret more disposable, but I think it needs to go further. Adding a passive like this could mean that the cooldown on the turret could be lowered as well as its damage. This would make it even less of a problem for the lower bracket players to deal with, and at the same time, the extra damage to Torbjorn himself would put more emphasis on the skill of the player as opposed to the auto-aim of the turret. With this change, a player would be less concerned about the turret, and Torbjorn could just throw it out during a fight, having it deal whatever damage it can, but when it gets destroyed, the player gets a little bit of a boost. This also creates an interesting situation for the enemy, as there may be occasions where destroying the turret and giving Torbjorn a damage boost is actually not the best idea. I still think that Torbjorn needs lots of changes, just like some of the other characters I've mentioned, but I think a passive like this could be an interesting way to go about it. Next is Tracer. This is a pretty simple one. Her passive is Close Call. Using Recall while having less than 25 health will instantly recharge 1 blink. This passive is kind of risk and reward. You can wait a little bit longer to use Recall, putting yourself at great risk, but if you do, then you get back one of your blinks for free. Next up is Widowmaker. Her passive is called My Parlor. Widow deals 20% more damage against targets that are under the effect of Infrasight or the Venom Mine. The idea here is to provide a little extra benefit for those two abilities. This incentivizes using the Venom Mine more offensively as opposed to just using it as a defensive measure. This change will be more impactful for the lower bracket than it is for the upper. Very skilled Widow players will often land criticals that are going to be one-hits anyways, so providing the additional damage doesn't change that in many cases. However, for Widow players that don't have the best accuracy, this will definitely help. And now we move on to the support characters. The first up is Ana. Her passive is called Still Got It. Healing is increased by 10 on targets that are at least 35 meters away. This is another pretty straightforward passive. It plays on the fact that Ana was this incredible marksman before her injury, and despite losing an eye, she is still quite capable. Most of the time when Ana is trying to heal someone, they're going to be well within the 35 meter range, so that extra healing would not be applied. However, this is still a nice bonus for when a teammate is far away. Next up is Moira. Her passive ability is called Further Testing. Fully depleting a biotic orb will partially refill the biotic healing meter. 30% for healing orbs and 10% for damage orbs. The idea behind this passive is to incentivize better use of the biotic orbs. It also helps with fights of longer duration where Moira would typically run out of healing. This provides the opportunity for good use of the orbs to help alleviate some of that. The amounts are different for two reasons. First, the damage orb has 100 less to deplete, and second, I don't want to encourage people to use more damage orbs, so the benefit overall is going to be much greater for using healing orbs. Next up is Zenyatta. His passive is called Balance. Zenyatta's shield regeneration recovers at 40 per second when both the Orb of Harmony and the Orb of Discord are active. Zenyatta is one of the only support characters without a true self-heal. Normally, shields will regenerate at 30 per second. This will start after 3 seconds of not taking any damage. So this passive doesn't change the effectiveness of Zenyatta while he is under attack. What it does is reduce the amount of recovery time that he has to go through after the fight happens. Also, this will only happen when the conditions are met, and unlike other self-healing, it only applies to the shields that Zenyatta has and not his normal health. And that's all the characters that currently do not have a passive in the game. Obviously, as I said before, just adding these would definitely be a buff to all the characters, which is why I said there would be other minor rebalancing required, but overall, I definitely believe that in the long run, having a passive on every character would be beneficial to the game, as it would allow Blizzard to have yet another one of those small dials to turn when they need to better finely tune and balance a character. Some of the passives that I presented I think would work extremely well, while others probably not the best. So let me ask you guys, what do you think of the passives that I came up with, and if you could come up with your own passives, what would they be? Let me know down below. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to see more, make sure you subscribe and hit that bell to get notified. You can get some cool gear, join my Discord server, or follow me on social media with the links down in the description below. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters, and remember, always blame the controller because it's never your fault.